Welcome. Nice to see you. I wonder if you would like to join me in a steady walk around what has now become known as the Cleethorpes Heritage Trail. We will also make one or two small detours to places of interest on the way, and also talk about the history of how Cleethorpes came about. Now, before we start our walk, let's consider how Cleethorpes started to change. Of course, we all know that Cleethorpes is situated on the coast of Lincolnshire, where the River Humber meets the North Sea. And way back, before the Norman conquest, the area was part of the parish of Clee, in the wapentake of Bradley. The parish was made up of a parent village of Clee and 4 hamlets named Wheelsby, Oole, Itterby and Thrunscoe. Wheelsby was, of course, inland, whilst Itterby, Oole and Thrunscoe were situated on the coast. These 4 hamlets were also known as the Thorpes of Clee, indicating that they were outlying settlements. Our walk, however, will only take us to Oole and Itterby. Oole and Itterby were communities whose main incomes were from agriculture and fishing. The wapentake of Bradley, prior to the Norman conquest, was held by Anglo-Saxon landowners, but after the conquest these were dispossessed and their lands divided amongst the Norman lords. The land was mainly farmed for these lords, but some of the area was divided into holdings which were farmed by the local farmers. Over the following centuries, 3 major events set out the future developments of Cleethorpes. The first occurred in 1616, when the Sidney Sussex College, which is a college in the University of Cambridge, purchased a considerable amount of land in the hamlets of Clee, Oole, Itterby and Thrunscoe, as well as in Grimsby. As a little aside, the Sidney Sussex College was founded in 1596, following a bequest made by a Lady Frances Sidney, who was the Countess of Sussex. She left a sum of £5,000 for the training of men into the ministry of the then Protestant Church. Unfortunately, this was insufficient to cover all the costs that the college had to meet, and for many years it had a major financial problem. In 1601, a Peter Blundell left a legacy of some £40,000 to various causes, one of which was the founding of 4 scholarships at the Sidney Sussex College. This money was used to purchase land in Bradley wapentake at a cost of some £1,400, the rent from which paid for the running of the college, and of course the college still owns a considerable amount of land in Cleethorpes. The second major event started around the 18th century with the emergence of the Methodists in Cleethorpes. A John Nelson, who was a Methodist preacher, visited Cleethorpes in February of 1743, and he records in his diary, "Some friends from Tetney and Cleethorpes prevailed upon me to go to a shepherd's house near the sea coast and pray with all those that were there." And again in 1781, John Wesley visited Cleethorpes, and he records that, "I preached at Cleethorpes, 3 miles from Grimsby, where there was an outpouring of spirit. I could not go into any of the little houses, but that there was presently filled with people asking me to pray with them." Methodism became a major importance in Cleethorpes and had a lot to do with the development of the town, as we will see as we go along our walk. The third, and probably the major event, was the coming of the railways in the 1840s. But we'll look at this further around the trail. Now at the moment we're standing in Alexandra Road, which runs from the Dolphin Hotel on the right through to the High Cliff on the left, passing in front of the Victorian houses and shops with the balconies and the beautiful wrought iron railings. Of course, Alexandra Road was originally known as Itterby Road and joined the fishing villages of Itterby and Oole, and was in the early 1700s only a track. But as the 2 hamlets grew, the track became a road. The name was changed in 1885 to commemorate the visit by Prince Albert Victor, the son of the then Prince of Wales, who visited Cleethorpes to view and open the new promenade and the pier gardens, and to honour the visit Itaby Road was renamed after his wife, Princess Alexander. Now, probably the best place to start our walk is here at the Cleethorpes Library and Information Centre. Of course, the first Cleethorpes Library was opened in 1902 at the Technical Institute at the top of Isaacs Hill. In the late 1970s, the new library was built, replacing a large car park and coach park at about this point in Albert Road, and a large house called Yarra House at this point. The house was built for a Joseph Chapman and was named after the Yarra Yarra River in Australia, on which the city of Melbourne stands. So now let's begin our walk, and we begin to walk towards High Cliff, but first let's detour up Yarra Road to the old Cleethorpes General Post Office, erected in 1907 for the benefit of the people of Cleethorpes, and was closed somewhere around the 1980s, when the post office was transferred to a modern building on the High Street. Later it became an artist studio and shop, and on his retirement in 2008 changed to the office of an architect. So now let's go back down to Alexandra Road and begin to walk up the hill towards High Cliff and to the area that used to be known as Itaby. We now come to the Baptist Chapel. The first chapel was erected in about 1910. Prior to this date, the Baptists had held their meetings at various venues. Now, during the 1418 war, the chapel was used to billet the men of the 3rd Manchester Regiment, and during the early part of 1916 there were some 70 men billeted there. In the early morning of the 1st of April 1916, a German Zeppelin passing over Cleethorpes decided to jettison his bombs, and one made a direct hit on the chapel, killing 31 men and injuring many more. And a lot of these men are now buried in Cleethorpes Cemetery. As we continue up the hill towards High Cliff, we come to Knowle House, originally built in 1898 for Sir George Moody, who was a fishing vessel owner and also a councillor. And Knowle House has for many years now been one of the administrative buildings for the Cleethorpes Borough Council, and now, of course, for the North East Links Council. It's a very fine building, and look at the beautiful stone carvings over the windows and the door. If we turn through 90 degrees, we see the new apartment block called the Point. On this site was the High Cliff Hotel, built for the ever-increasing visitor trade, and then became a public house and finally a nightclub. We are now in the centre of what used to be called the village of Itaby, and we're standing at the top of the shopping area known as Seaview Street. And as we look down Seaview Street, we can see that most of the shops have now been changed. The cafe on the right there used to be a jeweller's, and next door was, of course, a chemist. The oldest shop down Seaview Street is number 16, and this was opened in the early 1800s to cater for the needs of the many visitors who were now holidaying in Cleethorpes. Walking down Seaview Street, we come to Wardle Street. This was the centre of the fishing community, and we see on the right the Fisherman's Arms public house, and on the left a cook's shop. But this was in the 1940s and 50s, a general hardware shop at which you could buy nearly anything. If we walk down Wardle Street, we can still see two of the old fishermen's cottages at the end of the street, one of which has recently been modernised and is now a very nice small residence. In this area, the housing was very closely packed, and though they were as small as we can see from these houses that are left, it was recorded that one of the houses had 25 people lodging there. And also, due to the very poor sanitation, open sewers and general bad public health, in August of 1854 an outbreak of cholera decimated the area, killing some 60 people, of which 17 were summer visitors. Now as we carry on down Seaview Street, we can see through the gates of the what is called now the Waterwheel Antiques the remains of the village abattoir, and would you believe, the old bakehouse, At the bottom of Seaview Street, if we now turn round and look back, we can see on the left the Queen's Hotel, or as it used to be known, the Big G, because of the large letter G that used to be on the wall, and it stood for Gilmore's, the brewery. On the opposite side, the shop that is now an electronics shop was once the Meadow Dairy, and the name of the Meadow Dairy can still be seen in the tiles of the doorstep. Turning now and walking along Cambridge Street, we can see directly in front of us the Cleethorpes Town Hall. This was erected in 1905 on land which had been purchased from the largest landholder, the Sydney Sussex College, at a cost of some 7 and 6pence a square yard. Previously, the Cleethorpes Council had met at the Oddfellows Hall, which stood at the corner of Cambridge Street and Yarra Road. It can now be seen that the Town Hall is joined to the Knoll House by various buildings. And in the 1950s, with the Cold War threat, a nuclear shelter was built deep below the ground beneath the Town Hall, and one would assume for the use of the councillors in the event of nuclear attack. But what about us? From here we can see the top of St. Peter's Church, and we are probably standing in the same position as this picture, which was taken in about 1870. Before we go on to the next part of the tour, let's just detour slightly down Yarra Road and look at the new cottage-style houses being built on a site that was formerly part of the primary school and a dairy with its outhouses belonging to a family called Bycroft. We now start to walk down Cuttleby footpath. This was midway between Oole and Itterby, and along the side of the footpath was the first recognised school in Cleethorpes. It was what was then known as the National School, and it opened in 1815, and though it was a Church of England school, attendance was open to all the Cleethorpes children. Towards the end of Cuttleby there are 2 cottages built by and for a Mr. Edwards, who asked for building permission in 1876, the cottages being built in 1880. At the end of Cuttleby is Albert Road, named after Prince Albert Victor. If we cross over Albert Road and carry on down the short length of Cuttleby, we arrive at Mill Place, so named because of the mill which stood in this area, and it was similar to the one that is shown in this image. The houses built here were built in 1896 and carry carved plaques on the wall, one of which is the head of Queen Victoria. Atkins Bakery was sited in Mill Place, but was demolished along with other buildings to make way for the new cottages. During the demolition of the bakery and the garage, a millstone was found in the ground. Back in Albert Road we can see the vicarage, which was built in 1852 by Reverend William Price Jones, who was then the Vicar of Clee. He also increased the size of the National School so it could accommodate some 300 children, and the site of the school was where the present-day Church Hall stands. Price Jones, being conscious of the need of providing for the growing number of Anglicans in Cleethorpes, he became the driving force for the building of St. Peter's Church, and the church was then consecrated in 1866. St. Peter's Avenue was initially known as Oole Road, and only changed its name when St. Peter's Church was built. After the church was built, many elegant terraces were built along either side of the tree-lined avenue, which of course leads up to the High Street. Because of the ever-increasing size of Cleethorpes, this meant that the shops in Seaview Street could not adequately cope with the demands. So gradually over the years, these elegant townhouses in St. Peter's Avenue were converted into shops. So as we look along St. Peter's Avenue, perhaps we can see in our mind's eye the once elegant Victorian terraces with their ornate iron railings surrounding the neatly tended gardens. We now turn into Short Street, aptly named because of its shortness. We are then in the Cleethorpes marketplace. This was the centre of the hamlet of Hull, and in this marketplace John Wesley preached his sermon to the people of Cleethorpes on Tuesday the 3rd of July 1781, near a long farmhouse and the High Street, and beneath a large tree. And of course, nowadays, at least twice a week, a market is held. And if we look around, we'll see that there are quite a few restaurants and hotels in the marketplace. If we carry on walking towards the junction with Alexandra Road, we'll get our first glimpse of the sea. At this junction stands the very first hotel to be built in Cleethorpes, the Dolphin Hotel, or as it was known then as the Cleethorpes Hotel. It was also one of the first seaside hotels to be built in the country, and was visited by such people as John Byng, who later became Lord Torrington, and he describes Cleethorpes after his visit in 1791 as a bathing place of better complexion than those two others we have seen on this coast. The hotel was for a time used by the town council, and it was here that the Clee Enclosure Act was signed, changing forever the use of the open fields between Itterby and Hull, and opening them up as land for development. We now cross over Alexandra Road and enter the Dolphin Gardens, with its new centrepiece of the sculpture of dolphins. This was commissioned in 2007, after the award for the Britain in Bloom Best Coastal Resort in the UK. Now let's rest here a while and talk about the changing face of Cleethorpes. During the early to mid part of the 18th century, the hamlets of Itterby and Hull, having grown so that they were now one, and that they were now becoming known as Cleethorpes, and if we remember from the very early days, the economy of the area was based upon agriculture and fishing. However, as we near the end of the century, we are beginning to see that there are some indications of Cleethorpes starting to profess itself as a coastal health resort, which were then termed as watering places or bathing places. And as sea bathing and the drinking of seawater became more fashionable, so the number of visitors to Cleethorpes increased. Hence the building of the Dolphin Hotel, and also many of the houses were providing rooms. However, these visitors were mainly people of substance, and as we see from a statement of around the early 19th century, it would appear that Cleethorpes is now a favoured place for country gentlemen and members of Parliament to reside during their summer vacations, because it is one of the most pleasantest places for health and amusement in the county of Lincolnshire. Of course, Cleethorpes was not an easy place to get to, and one would require to have your own means of transport, or you could travel to Cleethorpes by coach from Lincoln and other places, or you could actually travel by water. This meant that people of working class living in the Midlands, etc., could not afford to visit the seaside. But this was to change with the coming of the railways. Certainly, the Lincolnshire coast was now attracting more visitors, and Cleethorpes had its own traditional attraction which attracted many visitors, but these would unlikely to be of the genteel type. For many years an annual feast was held at Clee, commencing on Trinity Sunday. This was transferred to Cleethorpes and became known as a fortnight Sunday, and it was held on alternate Sundays during the summer months on the sea front. Many people attended from neighbouring towns and villages of Humberston, Tetney, Fulstow, Thoresby, Waltham, Scather, Bradley, Laceby and many other places as far away as 20 miles. Stalls were erected at the front of the Dolphin Hotel,
near the cliff and on the sands, for the sale of goods and wares. This event became known as the Folly Feast, and it is said that on the arrival the men would partake of a threepenny tankard of October brewed ale, and of course this would be taken in excess. At the feast there would be pugilists, wrestlers and footballers. The feast became a scene of riot and drunkenness, so much so the magistrates had to step in and stop the feast, which occurred in 1786. The Folly Feast was held in an area we now know as Sea Road, and this was called the Folly Hall. So we can see that nothing much changes, does it? Continuing our walk further along Alexandra Road, we come up to the station approach, with its steep descent down to Cleethorpes railway station. But first, let's detour a little along Grant Street to the first Cleethorpes police station, which is now a private house, and further on to what is now known as the Number 1, which was the original railway station, built in 1863. Then we move on to the present-day station, which is but a short distance away, and was part of the Manchester, Sheffield and Lincolnshire Railway improvement carried out in 1885. Look above you at the clock tower with its four-faced clock, and the refreshment rooms, which were provided with walls almost all made of glass, which enabled the diners to view the seascape while eating their meals. We're now on the promenade, so let's just rest again on one of the seats and consider the major effect of the railway coming to Cleethorpes. The picture we are receiving of Cleethorpes so far is that the town is pretty much self-supporting community, with its mixed economy of agriculture, fishing and seasonal services to visitors. As I have already said, it was not an easy place to get to, and had little in the way of attractions, and catered mainly for the small clientele of mainly middle-class visitors. As a bathing place, it had to provide most of the amenities itself, with little help from any external services. Then, in 1848-49, the railway arrived in Grimsby, with two companies, the Manchester, Sheffield and Lincolnshire Railway Company, and a further one called the
East Lincolnshire Railway,
which constructed a line from Grimsby to Boston, and leased the line to the Great Northern Railway, which extended the line to Peterborough and then onwards to London. The opening of the railways coincided with the opening of the new dock in Grimsby. Unfortunately, though the railway company wanted to continue the line through to Cleethorpes, it wasn't until about 1863 that eventually a single track was laid to Cleethorpes. In 1849-55, the company made several attempts to get agreement from the landowners to cross their land. Though the Sydney Sussex College was agreeable, it was mainly the freemen of Grimsby who would not agree. This was overcome when the railway received permission to run the line along the shoreline of the Humber. Even when the railway terminated in Grimsby, the number of visitors visiting Cleethorpes increased tremendously. It is recorded on the 19th of June 1850 that there was an influx of some 5,000 visitors. The visitors would either walk to Cleethorpes or travel on one of the horse-drawn conveyances provided by the Cleethorpes hotel owners and business owners. And by 1852 the railway company were running their own omnibus. So the railway companies enabled many people from Midlands and Yorkshire to visit Cleethorpes. Regular cheap day excursion trains began to travel to Grimsby, and it is recorded that in 1855 a 40-coach excursion train ran from Derby to Grimsby, from which the passengers made for Cleethorpes. Cleethorpes was now beginning to take on as a seaside resort, and by 1860 there were many sea bathing machines provided by people whose names occur consistently and are well known, such as Joseph Grant, Edward Moody, William Ralston, Joseph Slight and Amos Appleby. All these and others had bathing machines for hire and booths on the sands selling oysters, biscuits and temperance drinks, including tea. Joseph Slight and Amos Appleby also had donkeys for hire and also ran pleasure boats. Now that the railway had reached Cleethorpes, it enabled many of the working class to visit the seaside. And unfortunately, this could sometimes bring about the unwanted side of humanity. It's recorded that on Good Friday in 1872, 5 excursion trains brought a total of 6,000 visitors to the resort. And though many of the visitors were just merely high-spirited, others tended to imbibe far too freely, and the public houses did a roaring trade. The local newspaper of the time reported that drunkenness stalked the streets, where men, women and children were drunken and sickened with drink. Bad language and fighting amongst youths and girls, and as the paper said, Bacchus ruled the day at Cleethorpes. So nothing's changed again, has it? This increase in visitors led to the thoughts of a pier for the resort, and applications were made as early as 1866, but progress was not made until 1872, when permission was requested to build a pier. 530 shares were offered for sale, and many were purchased by professional and business people, but also some individuals, including a policeman, a commercial traveller and a watchmaker, bought some. And also major landowners and the railway company became shareholders. The pier was eventually opened on Bank Holiday Monday on the 4th of August 1873. The entrance to the pier was then in the pier gardens and crossed over the foreshore. As the resort continued to expand, the problem of the ever-eroding cliff and foreshore began to come to a head, and it was decided to approach the railway company to see if they could assist. The railway company was indeed ready to assist, for this would safeguard their investments in Cleethorpes. And in April 1883, agreements were signed and work began on the promenade, which eventually would run the full length of the foreshore up to what is now called Ralston Street Slipway. This would include a seawall and the 2 slipways, and a structure known as Ross Castle, so named after the secretary of the railway company. It also included cutting back and shaping the cliff. Gardens were also provided, and these were called recreation grounds. And between Ross Castle and the pier, along the promenade, a small bathing pool was to be provided, with fresh and saltwater baths, hot and cold and shower baths, plus a large salt water swimming pool. There was also an aquarium, which later became a small cafe, and then was demolished, as was the swimming baths, to make way for improvements in about the 1960s. To make it easier for the people in the area of the High Cliff and Seaview Street, a set of steps were provided from the top of High Cliff down to the promenade. And from the 2 photographs you will see that the steps have been altered and made more grand. And of course, as it has been said before, the result of all this work was opened in 1885 by Prince Edward Albert. So let's look along the promenade as it stands today, with the entrance to the pier now at the promenade level. And the pier during 1940 was breached in an attempt to stop the possibility of invasion. After the war, it was deemed to be far too expensive to rebuild that part of the pier, and in the end the whole of the seaside of the pier was demolished. If we now walk up Sea Road, or as it was known, Folliole, back along to the high cliff. We pass through the pier gardens, and we finish our walk at the high cliff, where there are many tales about this cliff being used by wreckers to position their lanterns to confuse the passing shipping, and many cargo ships would go aground en route to Grimsby. We pass the memorial to the many airmen who flew over Cleethorpes during the war, and if we look out to sea, we can see the Spurn Lighthouse and the relics of the 1914-18 war in the persons of the Bull and Ale Sand forts. We've now come to the end of our little walk. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope you've learnt a little bit about the history of Cleethorpes. I thank you for listening to me, and I hope you haven't been too bored. Thank you.